So I welcome you to the next panel in our program today. We're going to, same topics that we've been talking about all day, different point of view, different experience. We don't have pictures. So, and we are open to questions at any time and interruptions, which is kind of how we've been going as the days progress. People have gotten a little bolder about asking the question when they think of it, which is nice. Which is nice. I think we all get a lot more out of that. So this panel is a panel of intellectual property IP thinkers. Okay. And that is a little bit different, although I have to say that we have heard the word IP mentioned, I think, on all the other panels or at some point in all the other discussions. And once or twice, I heard the IP used as a substitute for the product or the invention, which is something that some of us, we catch that, we hear that often, and we know that when you go from one environment to another, you sometimes hear that. So the first thing I want to do is to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about each one and then give them a minute or two to tell you about their environment, because I know we have a number of people in the room who are designers and you're familiar with where you work, but I thought you might help to get a frame of reference and know where our panelists are when they're not here sitting in front of you. I always like to know the environment someone's working in if I only get to talk to them on the phone, for example, most of the time. So the first person I want to introduce you to, I'll start on the far end, is Alana Sharenow, who is the director and legal counsel at Dunkin' Brands. Okay, so there's a familiar, very, very familiar product. And who I have gotten to know and has been very generous about coming and speaking and participating in activities here at Northeastern and both the law school and the business school. At first, I got to know her when she was the senior corporate counsel at Ocean Spray Cranberries, another product and local company that you know. I would say, and then I'll let her say what she wants to say, that Alana has experience advising and supporting innovation in different business sectors and also businesses that have different models for how they go about this. And I think that's that different experience of her gives her interesting points of comparison on thinking about IP. So do you want to tell us something about where you would be if you weren't sitting here with us?
Sure. I was thinking about my career over time. I've gotten the pleasure of working for 3 major Massachusetts corporations, one of which doesn't exist. But I started at Polaroid, where patent was king. You know, we were the 2 little trademark lawyers wagging our tails, but, you know, the patent lawyers ran the place, the patent inventors. It was really a scientific-based institution. And I moved to Ocean Spray, where it's kind of half and half. Science was very important. We had factories, we had plants, we designed bottles, we designed products. We had a brand, but we had a limited product line. But science was very important, and the brand was very important. And I'm now somewhere that doesn't make anything. We're just a brand. Dunkin', we own a few stores, but our brand is entirely a franchised organization. So the entire value of where I come from is our trademarks, our copyrights, our design elements in our store, our products, our speed to service is what we bring to the consumer. And it resonated with a lot of what everyone else is saying, that the consumer is driving your behavior, and we can see that. My day-to-day work is supporting the marketing and advertising teams as well as food law, which isn't really applicable here. But we spend, between the 2 brands, almost $300 million in advertising. So there's a lot of touch points of consumer communication between social media, TV, print, radio, sports sponsorships, and it's all just an extension of our brand. So that's my day-to-day world.
Hi. Our next panelist working this way is Steve McDonald. And Steve is currently the General Counsel of Rhode Island School of Design, RISD. Different environment. Prior to that, he was the Associate Legal Counsel at Ohio State University. And prior to that, he started off at a very well-known firm, Jones Day. And in the years that he has been at Ohio State and then at RISD, he's also taken a leadership position in a national association of college and universities where he has an opportunity to influence and participate in discussions among others who hold similar positions to him at other educational institutions around the country. I always like to recognize people who do volunteer things to that extent in the profession. In his experience, I guess I would say that I think of Steve as someone who has kind of a stunningly unusual and varied array of matters that can be presented to him by very creative students and faculty. It is an unusual environment, and if he doesn't have anything else to say, you can ask him about Socks the cat.
We can talk about that later. So hi. So I am, as Susan said, I'm at one of the most creative and innovative places in the world, and I'm a lawyer. I did take I don't know if you know this, Susan, I did take a drawing class a few years ago through our CE department to see if I could learn how to draw, and it turns out I made a very wise career choice, but I got better. I got a lot better. But I thought I'd just mention how I got to RISD and how I sort of, in some ways, became an IP lawyer. I'm actually the only lawyer at RISD, so I'm every kind of lawyer, but that's one of the areas I do. And it's pretty much entirely by happenstance. When I was in law school 30 years ago, nobody took IP because nobody cared about IP. You know, copyright, if you're going to go work for a publishing company, maybe, but it was a backwater of the profession. Nobody cared. And then Al Gore invented this thing called the internet, and all of a sudden everything became copyright and IP. Well, I had started out, as Susan said, at Jones Day, and I was just doing litigation and a lot of libel law, and I happened to work on what was the first online libel lawsuit. When I ended up at Ohio State, by virtue of that case, I was the computer law expert. I'm like, oh, really? I didn't know this. But on college campuses back in the early 90s, that's where the internet really was, and all sorts of things. And it turned out our students were doing all sorts of bad things with copyrights on the internet. And so I had to start to learn copyright, and I eventually just audited the class in our law school, which is right across the street from my office, and developed over 10 years at Ohio State some copyright expertise, and then started to think about becoming a general counsel somewhere. And in higher ed, you move up by moving elsewhere. And looked around, and RISD had this opening, and lo and behold, because of my copyright background, an art school was interested. So I've been there for 12 years now, and continued to develop that and to promote. And we'll talk more about that process. But I guess what I'm really saying is my entire career has been happenstance, which is not a bad thing.
Not by design.
Not by design, yes.
Okay, and then our third speaker, Gemma, is the general counsel of Velcro Group Corporation, Velcro brand, loop fasteners, a familiar product and a familiar brand. She's also the managing partner of Northeast Kingdom Tasting Center, and she serves on the board of directors for the New Hampshire Women's Fund. So. She, prior to being at the Velcro companies, a global group of companies, she was the senior counsel at BAE Systems. And I would say from my experience working with her and knowing her, that she brings us experience advising in a number of ways, but particularly one that I think might come out during our discussions is real serious experience with rebranding on a global scale and product development.
So when Susan asked us to say a couple things about ourselves, I was thinking about what might be relevant for this discussion. Back in the 90s, when I was practicing on my own with a couple of partners, I realized that there might be something going on with this stuff called software and these things called computers. And so I developed on my own some quick expertise around licensing. And I worked in technology licensing 95 through the 99 timeframe, and I had a client who recruited me in-house, and that was my first in-house position. And I spent a few years there, actually worked myself out of a job because the goal was to either take them public or get them funding. They moved to the other side of the country, And I then went to BAE Systems, and coincidentally, and I was going to talk about this before I saw you here, Rich, but when I got to BAE Systems, a couple of the engineers, I was new, it was a huge corporation, very different than my previous experience with a small software startup. Some of the folks came to me and said, hey, there's this stuff called open source software. And if we don't play in this space, we're going to be really at a competitive disadvantage. So once again, I took some time. I took some computer courses. I needed to learn how to speak your language. And I really engaged closely with the engineering community there and figured out how we could manage open source. And really enjoyed it and ended up actually participating in one of the GPL committees for GPL3, the introduction of GPL3. And that then, I was recruited by Velcro to come in and eventually take this role that I have now as GC. And that has brought me to a company where open source itself isn't as relevant because it's a products company, but certainly open innovation. And innovation as a driver for this company is very, very important. The Velcro companies, Velcro Industries is a very innovative company. The hook and loop is in places that you would not even imagine. It might be holding down some of these roofs or some of the turf on the playing fields, for example. Medical devices, automotive, military. We're in just about every vertical that you can imagine, and we're constantly innovating. So there's a healthy patent portfolio, and of course our brand is our most valuable asset, our most invaluable tangible asset, and of all of our assets.
So we have, in the idea in bringing together a panel of IP thinkers in this program was to have people who do that, who think about IP. And one of the things I've learned over the years is that this appeals to some people and not to others. The problem or the joy of IP is that it is infinitely complex and offers all kinds of ways to slice and dice and do something different and new. And it's also different in every country you go to. There are variations, and it changes as there are new innovations, because the laws in this area which are about protecting innovation were written before these new innovations came along. So they weren't written with what's going on now in mind. Certainly, for example, all of them were written before there were 3D printers or 3D scanners, what we were just talking about. So I thought it would be good to have people who are not only thinking about IP, but also thinking about how they help people who need to learn and understand IP, and also what are the processes? What are the processes you go through for deciding how you're going to deal with and protect or take the steps or not protect when you're operating in an innovative environment, including open innovation. And so I have a couple of questions, some of which build on what came before, but as I said, you can interrupt at any time, right? Put up your hand. You want to start right off? Yeah, somebody will come to you with a microphone.
I think this question's probably started with Gemma, but you all have legal training in IP in general. So part of my background, I worked in strategy consulting focused on technical IP with companies, and I recently went inside a company as well. And one thing I struggled with a lot of different companies, I don't know if I heard a good answer for yet in the world, is how to really integrate capturing technical IP with the design process beyond what I think of as the fundamentals of just covering the final design, but how do I actually use patents, trade secrets, and publications to create rings of confidence around using maybe things from the cutting room floor, or what? Have you seen any way to better integrate design and IP production and strategy?
So I'm going to answer that indirectly, and hopefully I'll get there, and certainly I'm sure the folks on the panel have some input as well. I have confronted that issue in the last 2 in-house roles that I've played, and in this one where it's a smaller organization and I have greater access to the innovative community, we've worked to think about intangible assets in a broader way, so that people aren't thinking, okay, I'm going through this process, whether it's just a traditional design process or more of a design thinking or open process. And at the end, I'm going to have an output, and then I'm going to protect that. So, for example, and I'm going to point to Joyce Skiff as my global trademark manager, who's with me today. For the service groups, and I wasn't at the earlier session, so I apologize for that. But for some of the service organizations that we have, we even think about the work that we do more innovatively. So rather than saying, okay, we've got a contract that we need to redline and then negotiate, let's get together, let's do it iteratively, let's prototype a clause. I mean, what the heck? Let's use those tools. And in doing that, we think about our contracts as intangible assets. And we think about the process of the design as an intangible assets. And everyone is sensitive to the fact that we either need to protect that or we have to think about what, after the prototyping and after the ideating and whatever we're doing, whatever the output is may in fact have some intellectual property, but it's certainly going to have a play in the product, in the commercialization. And what does that mean and how do we capture that? And I don't know if that helps. We can poke at it a little bit more. But to me, the answer of that question is get people to think more broadly about intangible assets so that they're not just thinking about the output, so that they realize through the process what they're creating, the know-how, the negative know-how, the trade secrets, however we're keeping them as we evolve this are important to the company. I don't know if that helps. Maybe, Stephen, you...
I don't work for a company, so I don't have that same issue. But it occurs to me as you were talking that our students may be in exactly the same situation as they think about this. I do a lot of talks to various classes talking to students about IP, and they're fascinated by it. But I start off by saying, you all came here thinking you're going to create works of great design and brilliant research and great art and so forth, and I'm sure that you are. But from my crass lawyer perspective, it's all intellectual property. You need to know what that is. You can choose not to exploit that if you want, but you need to know the rules, and then you can decide whether to break them. And so I spend a lot of time talking to them about what is a copyright, what's a patent, what's a trademark, and how they can structure their careers to think about that. And so I guess in some ways what I'm doing is what you just said. You need to learn his language. I needed to learn an artist's language, which is not my background, but they also need to understand my language. And if they get that up front, they're going to be able to integrate that thinking into what they do and take better advantage of the various protections. I don't know if that helps, but
not in my current life, but in my past life, Ocean Spray actually had a panel that convened on a monthly or quarterly basis, depending, and would review all the different aspects of what was potentially IP and make decisions whether it's going to be a trade secret, whether it was going to be a patent. They took a lot of care when drafting NDAs with third-party partners who were going to be making components. And there was just, I think the word they use today is a mindful process to figure out really what's important and what's not. And not everything, given the cost of applying for a patent, is worthwhile. So I think there's a lot of decisions made as to what to be put in the trade secret category, depending on the time frame of the project. And there's stuff that never gets incorporated into a product, but it's still important to have a patent on. So I think it helps if you're at a company, if you could get a group of people that understand the legal aspects and then marry them with people who understand the technical aspects to really figure out what's important, and then really, from my perspective, use your outside counsel who can really help identify, how to protect and draft the patents appropriately.
Elena, hang on to it. This question's going to be for you, okay? So in a number of the earlier panels, there was a discussion about the faster pace of design and the faster pace of change now. And rapid prototyping, the possibility of going through a number of prototypes and getting a product out sooner or designing it differently. We've also talked a little bit here today, but I know we also talked about the impact of the increased pace caused by social media with respect to shorter development and launch for marketing and advertising and changing of that. And so we have this increased pace, right? So how's that impacted your role? How's that impacted the way in which the company thinks about and works on and handles the IP issues that are related to those things?
It accelerates the process immensely. So whereas so Dunkin' introduced what we call them windows, but every 4 weeks there's new products in your Dunkin'. You have a new sandwich, you have a new beverage, you have a new muffin or whatever the products are of the month. But every month those products need new names. So there's the people who ideate the names are constantly sending names for searching. we're probably doing 50, 60, 70 trademark searches a month to clear names for products that are going to be there for 4 weeks. But you still can't infringe on third-party rights. But talking about how social media influences a product launch, I don't know if any of you live up here and remember, we did a egg and bacon sandwich on a glazed donut. It was in 5 stores. It was an alpha test. Somebody took a picture in their store up in Beverly or wherever they were. It wasn't meant to be a national launch. It was meant to be tested in 5 stores to see if it worked. It launched nationally 2 months later because the internet, it was an immediate sensation. They wanted the product immediately. We had to get job aids out. We had to get, the information out. So the internet is forcing us to launch products sometimes when we are only testing them nationwide instantaneously. So for us, it's huge. And our consumers are all tech savvy. I mean, I think we have 10 million Facebook followers, 4 million Twitter followers. They're engaged in the brand 24/7. I don't get it personally, but they are. And I'm reviewing materials, especially in the tweet area all the time. Can we respond to this celebrity, or can we tweet this out, or can we comment on some show, The Walking Dead, that's launched? Can we make a play on words or whatever it is? It's constant and instant. So I think that's changed significantly in my 20 plus years practice, is that I have to respond like in 5 minutes all the time.
And how long did you used to get to respond to a new advertisement?
As long as I wanted. At Ocean Spray, we shot 1 set of ads or 2 set of ads a year, and there was a long development process. At Dunkin', we shoot every 3 months because we have new products. The marketing people are constantly coming up with new designs and new creations and new ads and new scripts. And, within the company, they might go through 10 iterations. I only may see 6, but it's all the time. So there's no downtime. And there used to be.
And has that changed the way you work with the people in those departments?
Well, by force, you're always on. It does change the way you work. I mean, at Polaroid, it was much slower. Granted, everything was slower 20 years ago. But even at Ocean Spray, the difference is pretty substantial with how much Dunkin' does in comparison.
So I'm asking Alana this question in particular, and I want to let our other panelists answer, because one of the things I have sort of an inside, because a number of law students have done co-ops with Alana, so you know a little bit about her style. And I will say, as someone who's practiced for a long time, there's different kinds of IP shops in different companies. And I personally associate Alana with people who like to push IP knowledge out into their community and not be sitting as the oracle, and you have to come to my door and you have to wait till I get around and looking at it. But that's something that certainly was not the majority situation in most companies, and I think that certainly it's what we want to educate students who are in law schools now, but also students who are in business schools now, to have that knowledge, to become familiar with it. And so I know you have done that to help you with that cycle, among other things.
Right. I mean, we do a fair amount of training, and more often than not, people will do some preliminary searches before they come. The theory is once you've taught them a few times, they won't come asking with the same questions. The issue I face is in the level of junior level marketers. They change jobs all the time and they change companies. So where the senior people all understand the issues consistently, the junior people are constantly moving and changing. And there's just a new crop of young MBA students who have just showed up every year and a half. And so you're constantly retraining, but you don't get the longevity out of them. And I think that's across the board in consumer product marketing, is they move much more rapidly than in other fields. I don't know if you find that in your marketing teams.
I do, and on that, I think we can't be the oracle any longer because of the rapid change, but also because of the engagement that we have with our consumers, right? So purchase media and magazines or TV ads were one way, and now there's this sense of full engagement. I joke, both because of our geographic locations, but also because of social, that the legal department never closes, right? It's something that, and it helps us if we can empower, in fact, those junior marketers, if they understand that the brand is the most valuable asset. And that, you know, without the brand, and I like to tell people, and I ask people, you know, when you look at Nike's valuation, for example, how much do you think the brand is worth? What's the percentage of the company? And I don't know the latest statistic, but it's around 85%. You know, and so these young guys, they hear that and they're like, whoa. And of course, with Velcro brand as well, it's a huge part of our value. So we've got to teach them to protect it and use it properly, and to actually educate others in their networks.
And you have to have guidelines. I mean, there has to be some guidelines that they can refer to make some decisions on their own. You know, I can't be reviewing every tweet, so there's some, you know, guidelines of like, don't talk to celebrities, and, you know, don't post this and those post that. And it's only when they're going outside the guardrails that they raise their hand, because if not, you need, you know, 5 more of me, and they're not going to spring for that.
So that's a big change from nothing goes out until it's gone through legal. Now it comes to you if it's outside the guidelines.
In social media, yes, not in everything.
Yeah, question. I'm kind of in shock that I'm looking at a panel of lawyers talking about innovation, but I digress here a little bit. But so appreciate the space I'm in pharmaceuticals, right? A lot of patents, everything that you're talking about totally resonates with me. However, the engagement or collaboration to innovate in that space is lacking, obviously, in certain pockets. And I think you addressed this of, you know, there's different styles within corporate settings of the legals, outreach on innovation and approach. How do you suggest, as lawyers, how do you suggest approaching that group internally, like within a corporate, like a hardcore corporate structure, to be more innovative? Is it, you know, is there ways that we can collaborate more? Is it simply learning more about IP language that'll help get a foot in the door there, just to, you know, try to like move things in our space? Like a lot of times we try to launch these things, but it's actually the lawyers that stifle the innovation we're trying to do. So how do you recommend navigating through that?
So I'm going to take that in the first instance. One of the things, and this is a quote that comes from a book called The Invisible Edge, that's about intangible assets. And one of the quotes in there is that innovation without IP is philanthropy. Now, you may decide very consciously that you're going to innovate and give it away. I mean, you know, whether it's open source or some other mechanism that you're going to give it away. You want to create a standard, you know, for whatever reason. But you also need to be strategic, and it's, for my team, it's really important for them. You know, Joyce and her reports go to our sales meetings, they go to our marketing meetings, they want to know what's going on with brand development and what we're thinking about for social media campaigns, and we really have to engage. I actually, even now as GC, still really like to engage with my research and development group. It's always been something that I've been passionate about. I've gone into, we call them caves, we go in, we have a patent party. That's how I define it, because what I want to come out of there with is maybe 20 invention disclosures that may or may not stick. So I'm really going to encourage the design thinking approach to figuring out what we're doing, how we're innovating, and what we can capture, or what we don't want, as Alana said earlier, what we don't want to capture, what really might not have value, or maybe what has some value but not for our core, and we're going to sell that to a macro to Microsoft, for example. So it's really ensuring that you know, from the legal side, engage. If you have a department that's still just thinking about intellectual property as a defensive mechanism, I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think they're a little bit behind the times. You know, that's not how we should be using those assets any longer.
Just three quick comments. First, on your initial comment, I love lawyer jokes. The only problem with lawyer jokes is that lawyers don't think they're funny and nobody else thinks they're jokes. But that's a different issue. I'm curious whether the stifling that's happening is coming from IP law or is really coming more from FDA and other stuff, because your industry, you've got all sorts of stuff you've got to deal with, and it may not be so much the IP. But the main comment I want to make is, if your lawyers are telling you, no, we can't do that, you have the wrong lawyers, because your lawyers don't have the authority. The only power I have is to talk, and nobody has to listen to me. I give advice, not orders. I was actually once introduced by one of your fellow trustees as, this is Steve, the person who keeps us safe. And I said it in a fairly nice way. Actually, it's not quite right. I'm the person who helps keep you as safe as you want to be. I'm part of the risk management team, but I can't make you do or not do anything. And my job is to help you think through issues, but not to tell you what to do. So if your lawyers are really the source of the problem, and it may just be you think they have more power than they do, you've got the wrong lawyers, would be my thing. They should be part of this team that you're talking about to help facilitate whatever the goals are, and not the cops. It's not our job.
Yeah, I'm going to step out of my role as moderator and say that problem, and I don't know about your company in particular, but it's certainly what you said. I'm sure it resonated with other people in the room. People have worked in companies where, and we had actually the first IP Innovation Connection Conference was about when is IP inhibiting and when is IP helping innovation. And that too many people have that problem. The lawyer that says no and then crosses their hands and stops, that's the end of the discussion, or says, I see a problem, and that's the end of the discussion, doesn't engage in a solution, doesn't find a way, what do you want to do, let's figure out what you want to do. That's the reason that I came to this university, so that the next generation of lawyers and business people aren't like that they work collaboratively. And I say in my business classes all the time, if you get that kind of treatment, I say exactly what Steve said, don't use that lawyer again. You know, if you don't get somebody who engages with you and collaborates with you, they may not always deliver good news, but if they're not saying, well, tell me what you want to do, let's figure out a way how we can do that, that's old school.
Yeah, the right question to ask your lawyer is not can I do something, but how can I do something? You've decided what it is you want to do, and the lawyer can help you figure out the different paths and the different sets of risks that get you there. And we really have no authority to say no. I always tell people when I'm talking to them, if you don't take my advice, that's totally fine with me. I just want you to listen, and I will help you think it through. And I understand there's a whole bunch of stuff besides law that goes into the mix. There rarely is a question where I can say absolutely yes or no, you can do it. You know, can I commit murder? No, you really can't do that. But most of the things are more ambiguous, and there's lots of factors that go into the mix, and law is just one of them. So the lawyer should be part of the team, but not the police. And people have to be willing to do that. And sometimes, and this happens too, they use the lawyer as the excuse for not taking the risk that they don't want to take. And I'm fine with that too. I'm happy to be the fall guy, but just let me know.
So we have 3 strong brands here, right? Earlier in the program, Nathan made an allusion to brand hijacking. And I think also there's, certainly issues. If you have a strong brand that has a meaning and a relationship with the customers, carries a message, and has in what we call goodwill, then how do you manage the process of going through repositioning the brand or rebranding? Or I don't know, Nathan, if you want to say what you were curious about when you mentioned brand hijacking.
I think what Ora Ito was doing was taking pervasive brands, powerful brands, and demonstrating what he could do with that brand, almost like a prototype in some sense, was saying, if I had that to work with, here's something I would do to push it another direction. So it was really almost, I would say, almost like a work of art, a provocation. And it was a way for him to sort of emerge as, to get attention as a technique, as a method. I don't know if there were ever legal consequences. It was in France, so the laws probably are quite different there around intellectual intangible property. And but I think there's always a temptation for people to slipstream in someone else's success. And so one of the things that comes up in my mind is how does public domain operate? Because these rights are temporary rights. I mean, these ownerships, eventually things fall to public domain, right? In the end, at some point. something, at some point, these things fall outside of copyright law, for example. Like books come into public domain after a certain period of time, and people can do things with them that they might not do while they're under copyright protection. But it's interesting to me how imitation and faux and black market and gray market are so robust in the global marketplace. And we had, is Janos still here? We had a case where we had developed some, an idea, the possibility for marking pharmaceuticals, very expensive pharmaceuticals, marking them to prevent counterfeiting. And in the discussions with potential investors in that, a kind of remarkable thing was said that the pharmaceutical companies really didn't have an interest in that per se. They wouldn't necessarily see that as their problem, that the fact that someone could counterfeit their drugs. And they even said something that to the effect that counterfeiting in some ways markets the product. In other words, they don't have to pay for it, and it just makes more of that stuff, and it's more of that out there to be seen and traffic in the marketplace. And it didn't sound, it was, you're on the ethical edges there of how to operate in the world, but it seemed interesting to me that they didn't see liability in counterfeiting of their product. So anyway, this whole issue of imitation, faux, copying, appropriation are areas that artists have worked in as well. And I wonder how far people can go with that. Do you encounter that in your own?
About 5 questions in there.
Yeah.
Which one do you want to take?
So
Yeah.
the one thing, and just being a little contrary to what Stephen said, I mean, the one time, other than, don't break the law, but the other time that I actually will stridently say no is when someone's misusing my brand. And I've got a team of folks who are highly capable who help me with that. So
You're talking about somebody outside the company misusing your brand.
outside,
Oh
yes.
yeah, I'll go after them with like a ton of bricks. Yeah.
So, but also if I have, so for example, if I have a sales rep and we have walked away from very big accounts where the new account, think, large international internet distributor, won't agree to my trademark guidelines or wants to own derivative works, we say no and we walk away. So we're very, very strident about that. And that's where when I have to say to my sales guy, we can't engage in this relationship unless they're willing to use our guidelines and agree that they will never own a derivative work of our mark. So just very quickly, the history here, we had a patent, we had a monopoly on this market, the patent expires. We're still kind of going strong based upon, building up the market for this amazing material, hook and loop fasteners. And then we do start getting copycats. And we were, I think it's fair to say, Joyce, we were a little bit lazy after, around brand management. And then we realized, hey, there are folks who are coming here and what they're doing, they're making, it's the Lego versus the Mega Blocks, right? When you really look at them. Now my kids are Lego snobs, but honestly, if you look at a Lego versus a Mega Block, it's hard to tell the difference. And the same with a lot of hook and loop manufacturers. So now we have gone through a whole rebrand, new logo, lots of new marketing. It's been a very exciting time for us. We've actually won some awards for our rebranding, but we're still those guys. We're chasing them down, and we do it frequently. And we won't. Honestly, I won't. Sometimes I hold my breath because I'm not really sure if someone's going to say, "Too bad," give me the proverbial finger, so to speak. But we're strident, and we will prevent it at every turn. And any time that anyone is trying to pass themselves off as us, we're going to try to shut them down. It's really no tolerance. And that's the one area, as far as internally and with my teams, we really like to engage. We like to collaborate. We like to participate in innovation. But this is the area that I'm a gatekeeper, unequivocally.
That in part is direction probably from higher up too. It's really not just you.
It's
strategy.
part of the strategy, right.
Yeah, and you talked about they go into the public domain. Her hope is that Velcro never goes in, the name never goes into the public domain. That's the one IP that can last forever if you're good about it.
Passive, can't it?
Yes, and we're registered in every jurisdiction in the world. We have valid trademarks in every jurisdiction, and we police. We have agents, right, Joyce, in every country.
If you don't police it and if it becomes generic, you can lose it. So aspirin at one point was a trademark of the Bayer Corporation. Bayer aspirin is still a trademark, but anybody can make aspirin now. You used to have to make acetylsalicylic acid, whatever it was. You couldn't do that, but now you've probably seen those ads. You can't Xerox a Xerox. As Xerox desperately tries to stop you from using that as a verb as opposed to a noun because they don't want to go generic.
I apologize for using it today without the R with the circle around it.
Yeah, but that's very important, and for both you and to some degree for RISD, that's important. This is something that I talk to our students about a lot as well, because in certain departments, they really don't have a lot of IP. Furniture design, jewelry design, apparel design, not much there other than your name. I just did a presentation to some students a few weeks ago, and I showed the picture of Jennifer Lawrence walking down the red carpet in a Christian Dior dress, and the website for the next morning where they were selling the knockoffs of that dress. No protection there, but they can't use the word Christian Dior, and that's what's really valuable, because people will be willing to buy the Christian Dior version. Some people will be willing to buy the Christian Dior version, even though they can buy for $149.95 on the web. It's sale today, the same dress that Jennifer Lawrence had. I always ask the students at this point, when I'm talking about trademarks, I say, has anyone ever seen a green tractor? They all instantly know, John Deere. How do you know that? I said, that's secondary meaning. You need to protect that. I've never asked that question of somebody who did not know the answer to that question. It's amazing how firmly that is in the consciousness, and that's tremendously valuable to them.
Another question in another area, when I think it was prompted by your discussion about sort of the collaborative or collective or open innovation, and how and when IP, ownership of the IP enters the picture in these. There's one thought expressed was ideas are cheap and plentiful. Just make more, have more ideas. But at what point do you decide, well, that needs to be patented? And then if you have a collaboration, as Fidelity spoke of this morning, they sort of had this agreement that they're not going to, I don't know what exactly the terms of the agreement, but they were going to brainstorm together across companies in a room. And how do you treat that content of those sessions when someone the next day goes out and says, that reminded me, if I did this plus this, I mean, is it derived from that, or what's this, what's the origin, and how do you trace that back? The inventor, so to speak.
We weren't here at the time, but it was a discussion. I would say I can describe it in general terms like other ones, where a group of competitors were coming together to try and see if they could reach an agreement about how they were going to, let's say, how they were going to approach the FDA and satisfy the FDA. So it's similar to what's happened in other industries where competitors think early cell phones is one of my favorite examples, right? I don't know, there's enough people in the room who are old enough to remember when you bought a cell phone, you could only call people who had the same cell phone, right? Because they all had different platforms, and they all had different, they didn't communicate with each other. So they all got together, and it took a long time, but eventually they agreed on one. And so it's sort of a similar, that's a consortium situation. Sometimes we talk about it as standard setting. So do you want to talk about say anything about how the IP works in that kind of situation or not?
I have no experience there.
Nor I. You might.
The only industry collaboration I have is outside of IP. It's never within the scope of IP.
I walked into it. I'll answer it quickly. I mean, the way it works is, first of all, it's contract. Second of all, it's contract. Third of all, it's contract. It's like open source. There's a contract. And so the parties get together and they agree. Say, well, we want to do this. Here's what we want to talk about. Here's why. We have a shared goal. We know what we're talking about. We all know we're going to go off and compete on this platform, and we all know we have things we don't want to share. So we define what it is we're going to talk about, and we all agree that within that space, we're going to toss, often it's a pool, and you toss the patents in, but within that space, we all agree that none of us will assert any intellectual property rights against each other, ever. And as that became more sophisticated with standards, they realized they need more follow-on terms, which is, and we won't get patents on whatever the standard is. We all agree. Or if we get a patent, we will license it to you on what are called FRAND terms, right? So, but it's ahead of time. Before going in, there's an agreement, and it doesn't mean that there's no IP. Those are often in very patent-intensive environments, especially with respect to the people who are not in the consortium, right?
There are collaborations between pharma companies where they share the IP delivery. So one person may have created it, the other one actually puts it through the trials. And there's obviously a contract of a clear delineation of who owns what percentage you get, and royalties and all that.
So I haven't been in one of those pooling type of arrangements or consortiums where the IP goes into a centralized place. But what we have done, and this works a lot more simply in Europe than it has in the States, but we haven't done it as well here in the States, where we say, look, we'd like to figure out how to bring our unique capabilities together or work on a project to get into a new market. What we really care about is fastening technology, hook design, adhesives, fastening. Everything else, we're not really concerned about if it's not. So you can have everything else. If we innovate, if you innovate, if we innovate together, let's not let IP have a chilling effect on what we're going to do. So we're going to, and then oftentimes what happens is the other side, and again, we've done this very successfully in Europe. I've got 2 such engagements right now with companies where we're really looking at some market shift if we can innovate and pull this off. They say, oh, well, geez, I'm interested in printing. That's what I'm just hypothetically, this is my thing. So if it has anything to do with printing, I'll take it, and then let's see what happens with the rest of it, whether we own it jointly, whether we, don't protect it. And it becomes, it has an overarching effect of really opening things up and eliminating that, well, this is mine, this is yours, or this is joint, and if it's joint, who pays for the patent application, who picks outside counsel, blah, blah, blah. We dispense with all of that. Now, I've done it in the U.S. It's a little tougher to draft those clauses in the U.S. We have to be a little bit more particular about fastening technology and what that means. So it just gets a little bit more granular. But we're really hoping to bring that model to some of our U.S. relationships now that we've had some great success in Europe.
Why is that a difference? Is it cultural?
I think it is cultural. I believe that we have the trolls here, and I'm not as familiar with what's going on in Europe with the trolls. I know they exist there, but with the NPOs here and some of the litigation, and also just some of the changes at the USPTO, maybe just issues at the USPTO. But I'm speculating there. So I know you wanted to ask a question a little while ago, and you never got to there in the back. Yeah. Oh, okay.
The question in terms of IP, and it was, sorry, and it was mentioned something about regulatory. I know, since we were talking about social media before, that in the healthcare, in terms of especially with marketing getting close to the customer, there's a barrier there in terms of what you can say or what you're liable to say. So if a person says they're from X company and during the social media time that they mentioned there was an adverse effect, if that's not reported, then the company's liable. So a lot of the companies have actually gone through third parties so that a third party to do that kind of connection or find out more about in terms of, the consumer or the patient, so that there won't be that liability, which really hinders in terms of companies wanting to getting closer to the patient. And particularly since with social media being used a lot now, it just kind of hinders the company.
So, and I'm not familiar with that from a healthcare perspective. I mean, we do all of our social, we have staff that does our social engagement within the company. I mean, of course, we outsource some of that, but I think as a products company, it might be a little bit different.
Yeah, we don't have that restriction when if a consumer posts something negative about our company, our consumer care team will reach out to them directly. You know, they won't engage in a conversation, but they'll say, "Hey, can you call us at this line?" Or, you know, "How can we help you? We'd like to solve your problem." And we try to take the discussion offline, and really try to solve their problem in the social media space.
And I think this is just opposite because in terms of lack of knowledge of knowing that adverse event, the company is still liable in terms of from, you know, like a medical affairs or regulatory perspective, because anything that happens in terms of a product, you have to report and you have to investigate and you have to follow through to the end. But how do you do that if you have an employee and if it's so loose where he says, okay, I work for company X, and someone says, oh, yes, you know, we tried it and somebody, I mean, this is more dramatic in terms of saying they died, but something happened to them and that's not reported back. Not that it was intentionally, but it was something that maybe the employee didn't know. Or
this is pharmaceuticals.
Yeah,
You're talking about. Yeah, this is not within the food regulations. This is within,
right. So
this is sort of a wrinkle in the FDA regulations that imposes responsibilities on the company that applied to the FDA for that particular, and so has certain responsibilities to follow up with the FDA and supplement information if they have the information. But I think we can pose it a little differently in this sense, which is if engaging in social media, somebody at your company is engaging with a customer, and the customer tells them that something related to the IP, that they know somebody else who has the same mark. That'll get your attention, Elena. New product, and somebody engages in social media and says, "Oh, that's my trademark. You're using my trademark." I mean, then it would be something that the company would want to respond to, or at least to know about.
Yeah, in my past life, that almost never happens because we've you've searched and you've cleared. You know, our consumers are the best source for us of pointing out when someone's violating our marks. This is their brand. The Dunkin' consumers are incredibly loyal. They are our best source of when someone's infringing. They send us examples, they send us pictures, they send notes to customer care. I mean, it's truly amazing that they don't want their brand hijacked, which is for us great. But we never really, I mean, we do have people who violate our brand, but most of the consumer media comments are just, I didn't like my sandwich more than I'm infringing. I mean, there's some parodies out there that are really kind of offensive that we do try to taper back, but not so much with a brand like ours.
I think one of the broader points out of what you're saying is, I mean, social media is not just about IP; it's about everything. If you're, I always tell people if you're going to have a web page or you're going to be on Twitter or whatever, guess what? You're an international publisher and broadcaster. You need to comply with the same laws the New York Times does. So, you know, you were talking about rights of privacy and publicity earlier with celebrities, libel. If you're talking in your field, FDA stuff is going to apply. It all applies. The fact that it's cyberspace. Many people think cyberspace, they follow what I think of as the Captain Kirk theory of jurisdiction, which is when they turn the computer on, Scotty whisks them into this other universe and there are no laws and rules. But no, all the rules that apply offline apply online. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, so I have a question about what happens when IP protection disappears or changes or is in sort of like becomes from a known state to an unknown state, some sort of thing which is probably not relevant to any of you, but the recent Supreme Court decision that sort of, you know, could in some ways invalidate all software patents, that like you can't just do it on a computer ruling. Have any things of that nature applied to any of your work, and how did you deal with it?
Talking about Alice Corp.
Yeah.
So I won't address that specifically, unless we'll debate that afterwards over a glass of wine or beer or something like that. But I can talk about software patents for hours, I think. But in any event, from the Velcro brand perspective, and given our history, we have a pretty robust portfolio of patents, and we watch. So we do have some patents that are going to expire sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. And so we spend a lot of time, and we do this anyway when you do competitive analysis and you figure out, it's very easy to figure out what your competitors are doing by looking at what they're filing at the USPTO and analyzing those claims. So, and I'm sure that goes on. I'm sure there are folks in this room whose companies do that kind of analysis all the time. But similarly, you need to look inward and apply that to yourself. And so you need to say, okay, if this critical patent that has gotten me $10 million worth of business is expiring in 2020, how can I extend that? What am I going to do? Or how am I going to innovate around it so that I can protect that market share? And so we do that when we look at the health of our portfolio of the real estate. And we want to make sure that we keep that protected, right? That sandbox is ours. We've been really lucky that we haven't faced a decision that something is invalid or generic. Really, really lucky about that. But I would imagine, I mean, in that, if you think about that from a brand perspective, that probably would be the biggest risk. None of us, certainly Duncan or Velcro is not at risk for that, but then it's a whole new strategy. I mean, really, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater if you were to lose a brand. So that's pretty traumatic.
So on sub-brands, so we might have Munchkins here, but in countries where we've applied, but the stores haven't opened yet, we're always very careful for vulnerability for non-use. So in some countries, you can lose your right to your mark for non-use for 3 or 5 years, depending on the jurisdiction. We will file new applications and let old ones go abandoned just so that we keep the clock running. So we have an entire team that makes a concerted effort to never let our core marks go abandoned, even if there's even for non-use, we'll continue to apply. And then there's some old marks that are historic that we rotate in either on cups or on tabletops or somewhere that we have continuous use. I don't know, there's a little donut man. That's one of the iconic marks. So we have a program for keeping all of our iconic marks alive because the fear is if we let them lapse, someone will come up with a Mr. Donuts who looks like I would argue, the Pillsbury Doughboy in donut form. But you have to have a program for maintaining that from a trademark standpoint.
So, I guess my question, I used Alice Corp as like an example, but I use Alice Corp as like a recent potential example, but has that sort of unexpected fall through ever happened to you? So you know when your patent is expiring and you can look up the regulations in different jurisdictions.
Well,
but
our job, and I'm assuming that I'm speaking for everyone, our job is to make sure that never does happen, right? It's as the general counsel of an innovative company where intellectual property is really important and our brand is a large part of our value. That's what I do, is really, in my team, that's what we do, is to make sure that we don't ever face that type of risk. And it's through collaboration and strategy and thinking about innovation as holistically as possible, as part of the business strategy.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, we've had a couple of questions that I'm not sure, we answered them, but a couple of them seem to be about, well, doesn't something at some point go in the public domain? I think Nathan said that, and there's this. So, Steve, you're talking to young designers, people who are in school to be a designer. So what do you tell them about this, about when they can use something, when something's no longer protected, whether it's a trademark or a copyrighted patent? How do you explain that to a designer?
Of course, I use the lawyer phrase, it depends. We talk a lot about that. One of the things I do in the presentations I do is I go through, you talked about appropriation art, actually, and just go through a lot of examples. We first talk about principles of copyright law, for example, and that under current law, for the most part, it's life plus 70, which is a really long time. Your copyright rights last long after you do. And so I tell them, Andy Warhol still makes, lots of money, tens of millions of dollars. It goes to his foundation every year. Elvis Presley is still one of the top grossing musicians every year. And when he dies, we'll know how long his copyright rights last. And still nobody laughs at the joke anymore. I just feel so old. Nobody gets this joke anymore. My students definitely don't get this joke anymore. But we talk about that, and then we just go through lots of, every couple months there's some new appropriation art case, and we just look at images of those and we talk about them, and there is no answer. I mean, it's very ambiguous when you're in the fair use sense about when you can do things. It's a little more clear in like trademark and so forth, but in the copyright area, it's just fair use is a total, Wild West in some ways. And so we talk about that and talk about risk management and so forth. One of the things I learned, I didn't know this when I came to RISD because I knew virtually nothing about the process of creating art, but artists are natural lawyers. They have the grayscale. They're very comfortable with shades of gray. They only have 10, but they're comfortable with dealing with that ambiguity in ways that, most of my clients when I was at Jones Day weren't. They wanted yes or no answers.
You mentioned working with open source, but in this group, there've been people during the day who've talked about open innovation and collaboration across company lines, and how much that is encouraged. And in that space, what do you do? Everybody's in there, and somebody gave an example of a meeting and how they all got together for the weekend. They agreed, okay, this is some kind of free zone. And they were all from different companies, but they wanted to be encouraged to speak openly. So it was a kind of rarefied open innovation environment. So as companies adopt this, and as there's a sort of, even if you don't adopt open innovation, you have consumers throwing ideas in through social media. So you have at least openness in one way, maybe coming in and not going out. But ideas are coming into companies other than being born here or made here, right? So in one way or another. And so as that's going on and that's encouraged for other reasons, then often I think it's the case that the IP lawyers are asked to kind of run, once there's a product or something they want to sell, then the IP lawyer is called up and told to kind of run around behind and find something that you can identify as IP and quick secure it after this wonderful open innovation has gone on. Do you have any thoughts on that, or have you had that experience?
So my reaction is that to call the IP lawyer at that stage and have them run around and capture something, it's way too late. The IP lawyer or someone from the IP team should have been part of it right from the beginning. And ideally, that lawyer or that team would have said, okay, and I talked about the sandbox or the real estate, I know my portfolio is really robust. And I'm really happy with the way I've protected my core technology. And because of that, I can be very open with what I do. I've got, these monopolistic pieces of these documents that are protecting my core. So I can be open, I can share, we can innovate, we can collaborate, because I know that my core is solid. The foundation has been built, if you will, and all of these other bricks that are coming on are only going to enhance what I'm already doing. But by having the attorneys, and I took this approach at BAE Systems, and certainly now with my team, we have an enabling technologies group, we have our standard R&D group, we have our open innovation group, and my folks are embedded with them. They're part of the team. So when we go into these caves, and literally it's people, a real cross-section from the company, not just engineering and not just my my chemical engineers or my material scientists. We get a cross-section. I get some functional folks in there, and they do the design thinking brainstorming session, and we work together, and oftentimes we invite folks from the outside to come and help us, and we forge new markets that way. But there's someone from IP, the IP function, that's part of that process, whether it's a patent agent or one of my trademark folks or someone, we're part of that process. And so we know as we evolve what the strategy is, what the market is, what the business case is going to look like, and what IP we might have to protect or share or not care about. Right? And then that's the other thing. Sometimes people come with their head on fire. Oh my God, they showed this to a customer. Do we really care about that? If we do, then we have a problem. But if we don't, it's the NDA thing, right? Oh my God, they shared this information. Well, is it confidential? Let's ask. That's the first question before we set our heads on fire. Let's really figure out what we need to worry about.
Duncan takes a slightly more conservative approach. So with all of and the only people we're collaborating with for the most part are agencies. So ad agencies, PR agencies, creative teams. We take the approach that if we've retained you and you create something for us, we own it. And that's sort of a cost of doing business with us, so we don't really have the same risk. The interesting risk we're discussing, and we have not come to any sort of internal alignment, is Starbucks has a policy, send us any of your ideas. You send it, we own it, but we'll take anything in. We're kind of queasy on that, with the fear that even if your policy says anything you send to us, you own, do consumers really, A, read your terms and conditions? Do they understand your terms and conditions? You know, is it like a click wrap adhesion contract? So we've taken the position where we discourage, we can't stop it, but we don't actively encourage consumers to send us their ideas. And, you know, we fluctuate back and forth on our risk tolerance on that. And, you know, Starbucks is very risk tolerant. And I think in the scope of things, we're more risk adverse. Now, whether that needle will move over time, as there's more case law and more evidence to know how it's treated, it'll be interesting to see. But right now, we're still on the queasy side.
You know what's interesting about that comment? Your customers are actually doing that subconsciously. So, like for the example with the donut, bacon, egg, and cheese thing. So somebody posted that picture. You were forced to do that. They didn't have to submit any idea. They liked the idea that somebody else gave, and then you had to actually apply that across all your chains.
Well, that was our idea. Interestingly enough, we just have a slightly slower rollout. You know, so we tested in 5 stores to make sure that people can make it, and then it goes to 20 stores. But yes, our consumers do dictate how quickly products move, and a lot of test products end up being either killed because of the consumer or moved nationally quicker. So yes, they don't generate the ideas though, so that you're not getting the claim of ownership. And we're very clear when we run contests. We run a lot of recipe contests, especially in the ice cream side. You know, build an ice cream that whatever you send us, we own, so that you're not coming back down the road and said, you know, I created this ice cream. But you know, we do. Our consumers do dictate a lot, but it's not unsolicited.
I mean, that's the avenue that you're taking, though, that's different than maybe some other approaches in innovation, because you're actually getting customer feedback real time that can actually help adopt things faster or actually scale back on things as well.
Right. I mean, that's the nature of a business that has new products every month. You know, there's something always in test somewhere in the country on any given day, whether it's at 5 stores, 10 stores, 20 stores, or, you know, a 400-store market. There's always something moving. That donut example just kind of caught us with our pants down a little. Like, we had never had that happen. And then the national media picked it up, and, you know, Good Morning America wanted samples, and, you know, we're scrambling to show up the next morning with samples on, you know, whatever it was today or NBC. So it gets picked up very, very quickly. The flip side of that is when you do something not so good, it gets picked up equally as quickly.
Well, and I'm sorry, I was going to say, I think there are some differences, too, in the types of markets that we're servicing, because for me, if someone's going to use my hook and loop, my core products in an innovative way, I love that, because that means I can sell more hook and loop. You know, a good example is duct tape. I mean, I have teenagers, and I have younger kids, too, and gosh, they use everything. They make everything out of duct tape. I mean, like clothes are being made out of duct tape, and I think that's great. I'm sure duct tape thinks it's great, too, because they're selling that stuff at a pretty high margin. You know, so it's a difference, right? I'm really happy if people are going to embrace my products and use it to craft or to, you know. Oh,
we want people to use it. And I mean, the amount of people who decorate their cups and decorate their donuts and dress up their donuts for Halloween, we love that space of it because it's really consumer engaging. But it's on the formulaic side that we're a little bit more wary. But, oh, no, dress your cup, dress your donut, send pictures.
I think that this is a good example of where there's real variation in industries you know, you've kind of gone back and forth between 2 examples. Somebody takes your product and does something with it, takes your donut and decorates it for the holiday, or versus a customer sends in and says, here's an idea for a product, and it is kind of an enticing different or improved product. So in some industries, this is a huge risk. So you take Hollywood, right? They have all kinds of walls around the people who write scripts to prevent them from getting those fan letters with the attached 1.5-page description of a great idea for a new TV series. because it's really the case that they get so many of those. Most of them have different mailboxes, separate buildings. I mean, they really try and isolate those unrequested idea submissions, because eventually they'll make a TV series or a movie that seems sort of like it was taken, or gee, it's awfully similar, and it's worth so much that there's a lawsuit, a constant lawsuits in that industry. So that's an industry where you're not going to get to pitch your great idea for the next TV series. But other industries where they're kind of interested, they'll say, file a patent application before you see us, and then come in and tell us about it. That's okay. They'll deal with that. And then others will say, it's too risky, we don't have the setup. So there's a variation, and just the variation between the two that you talked about. Some of that has to do with history and the size of the risk, the amount of the risk. I mean, it's a bigger loss if someone, as George Harrison once learned, you know, if you're accused of, if you have a best-selling record and it turns out to have infringed, wittingly or unwittingly infringed a copyright, right? It's hard to unwittingly infringe a copyright. Sometimes, you know, in some industries, it's such a high cost that it's a management decision to protect against that. Yeah. We haven't had those 3D printing questions that we had earlier. I want you to help me remember some of them, Mark.
Yeah, so one of the things that we talked about was the idea of personalized products. Like, is there a concern when we look at allowing consumers to be part of the design process, where there could be concerns about them wanting to own the IP that they create if they customize their own products? Like, if I make a color combination of a Nike shoe and everybody ends up wanting it, my friends want it, like, do I have any ownership over that, or do I just give it all up? Like, how do we look at when we invite consumers into the design process of products, which is going to happen? How do we just say, listen, we own everything? Or is there going to be a conversation about, if they have good input into it, is there another possible way to take a look at how the IP shakes out? So
I'm going to take off my official hat for a moment and respond to this from just a personal perspective. And my view, the view that I bring to that, is that if you're going to come to me with a new concept or a new design element, and together we're going to create some new market, and then together we're each going to make 50 cents, it's better than me making nothing. You know, it's $1, right? If we're going to make $1 and we share it, that's better than us not collaborating and making nothing. Now, that's a personal perspective. Probably from a corporate perspective, it's hard to get there. And I keep going back, and I actually do a lot of intellectual property training within my company and through some of the associations that I belong to. You know, I talk about, from a corporate perspective, again, if you're robust in what you protect, if you've got a really good intellectual property strategy, and you've done a solid intellectual property or an intangible asset audit, so you know what you have, and you know what you need to create so that the core is solid. And this certainly goes to open source. I mean, if you're creating standards, if you know that what you're bringing to the table is going to, you know, raise up all the ships, then that's only goodness. But you've got to have that foundation, that core in place. And then, so if we think about it, if I was to think about it from a hook and loop perspective, you know, kids are making those rubber band bracelets, and so they're selling all different kind of brands. And I have thought, you know, wouldn't it be really nifty if there was some way that we could do something like that with hook and loop that would really grab that tween girl's attention? And man, would I be selling a lot of fastening tape. You know, whether or not someone could figure out how to design that for me, or if someone just, you know, if I wasn't even thinking about it and they came up and introduced it to the market, you know, I know that they could not create their own tape without infringing my patents, right? I own every possible hook design that you can imagine as it applies to this fastening technology. So I'm really safe there. So from an application perspective, Or if I do it and they change it a little bit, or they make more colors and that color hits, where's the harm? We're selling more stuff. So and again, I think there's a lot of corporate entities that might have a really hard time with that, and also depending on the vertical, maybe there needs to be this work made for hire approach. If you're going to design it, I still own it if you're using my stuff. But I really would like to think that if we had a solid base, if my intellectual property, I know I'm really, really good at what I do, and my foundation is solid, then I'm okay with you owning some nuance or some design or some color or what have. And again, I don't know if Nike would be happy with that, but that's the approach that I would take.
So let me just add something from RISD, which may or may not translate into your respective fields. But one of the very first things that I worked on when I got to RISD was our intellectual property policy. Colleges all have these about our faculty work for hire or not, and very controversial issue and how you do stuff. Traditionally, the policies are viewed in terms of ownership, which is a totally binary thing. You own it or we own it. Which one? What we spent our time at RISD talking about was not who owns it, but the fact that we're engaged in a collaborative enterprise which is designed to create intellectual property, and we want to figure out a way to promote that. And we both want to use it because we're both contributing to this in various ways. So let's talk about the ways that we each are going to be able to use the intellectual property that's being created here by whoever is creating it. And we worked out lots of details about, RISD can use images of faculty work for web pages and so forth for classes and all these things, and faculty can do various things. When we got to the end of that, my perspective is, I don't really care who owns it because I've solved all the problems I care about at this point. Ownership becomes almost irrelevant. It's really not the most important thing. It can be if that's all you talk about, but then you get this binary I win, you lose kind of conversation, and it's totally unproductive. So if you can spend time talking about really, the kind of things you're talking about in a different way, you can actually incentivize people, I think, to be more collaborative and to be more creative, and we each get the 50 cents, which I love that idea.
Mark, you did help me remember that the other one of the other questions that came up during your panel, I think it was Janos, was talking about how he's got some projects he's doing now with these 3D scanners, and they're about as big as this now. And he's told me that by the time the end of the current project's done, they'll be in your phone. Can have an app in your phone that has a 3D scanner. So, Steve, if you've got students and they're beginning to use these, so they go up to something and they scan it, and then in their computer they have that, and they can alter it before they print it or send it to a printer. They can change it, but they're starting with something they scanned from something else. They can walk around town. In this particular project that he has, they're out in public, so they're scanning objects, people, buildings, sculpture. Take your pick. And the students are now sort of raising issues and working collaboratively with law students on this, but none of those law students are in the room. So what do you think? If you were talking to these young artists that are using scanners in this way, what would you want to talk to them about? What would you want them to think about?
So I didn't know they were that advanced. I hadn't even thought about this, but that's interesting. It's a variation of the appropriation art kind of thing, because you're almost certainly, I scan this, I've got I've got a logo, a trademark here. I've probably got some patents in this, all sorts of things in here that I suppose the scanner may be infringing on, and you need to think about that, and you need to think about what are you going to do with that thing, which is really the ultimate question. The scan itself may not be a major problem, but when I create the new product, it's almost certainly going to be a new problem. And if I want to use that logo, I know that those people are going to come after me, because that's one of the world's most valuable trademarks right there. So I'm actually had to think about this. I hadn't really thought of it, but it's a variation of the thing I talked to the students about, appropriation art, and where the margins are, and where the true gray areas are, and risk management. But they do need to be aware that there are issues in doing that. And it's probably not just IP issues, it's probably all sorts of other issues that I haven't even begun to think about, because this question just popped up. Good question. Put that on your next law school exam. and tell me the answers you get.
The law students are supposed to be working on this with the designers. This is an example of a project between two schools on campus, 3 schools, I think. Actually, there's someone from Nathan's nodding. There's someone from engineering in it as well, and so they are also looking at, you know, they're out there scanning people too. So there's privacy and
privacy issues.
I think one of the first episodes was when Janos took his scanner, walked over to the MFA, and you can take photographs of work there. There are certain collections or exhibitions you cannot take photographs, either for UV problems, but also for copyright or ownership. So he found a couple of objects that were on display there and made some scans of it, and he was sort of doing a little test of the system, so to speak. And the security guard in that gallery came over and approached him and talked to him about it. So he engaged in a conversation about it. And actually, I think developed, maybe Mark knows more about this, but I think it developed a conversation with the MFA about how they might think about this, given that they've appropriated a few things over the centuries.
Museums are totally changing their view on this, and it's actually not an IP issue that much, because the MFA doesn't own the copyright to almost anything in its collection. It owns the object, but not the copyright. Many of the things in the collection are public domain, but they still have the right to say, you can't take a picture of this if we want to, because they have physical control over it. And museums used to, in the old days, because they wanted to preserve the right to make posters and postcards, you can't take pictures of anything, including something from 5,000 years ago that has no copyright, or even, you know, the most modern thing that they don't own the copyright to either. And if you wanted to take your own personal picture just as a memory, that's fair use. It's not really a copyright issue anyway, but it was that physical control. But now museums realize that the revenue stream from posters, whatever, really isn't worth it. But drawing people in is important. So that now everything is up on their websites, and they're delighted if people, to use your example of, you know, the putting on Twitter or whatever, they love when people are tweeting things around, because that draws more people in to the museum. So the real value is not IP. There are tons of things in the MFA that are under copyright, but the MFA doesn't have that copyright. Somebody else has that copyright. They just own the object. When you walk into a bookstore and buy a book, you own the book, but you do not own the copyright. When they own a piece of art, they own the piece of art. They almost certainly haven't bought the copyright.
The biggest distinction between looking at 3D scanning is a question that comes up time and time again when we get into this. Is a 3D scan the same as a photograph? Is the extra dimension, the 2D to 3D, how much of a difference does it actually make? Or, you know, is a black and white photograph different than what is the distinction? What is the gradient of this technology? And that has come up really interesting, because you mentioned, well, if someone takes a photograph to take home, sure, that's fair use. But if I take a 3D scan of a sculpture and then print it out at my house, is that fair use?
So now I have a law school exam question for Susan. There's a famous case from, 20 years ago, Corel versus Bridgman, that had to do with art history slides. Of mostly public domain works, and Corel just bought art history slides and scanned them in and sold the product in a big lawsuit over copyright. And the court decided, well, you can't have a copyright of a verbatim, I think slavish reproduction was the phrase, photograph of a public domain work, because you've added nothing original to that. That's great for 2D. It doesn't really work for 3D, because every time you take a photograph of a 3D object, you're selecting. There's an angle, there's shading, there's whatever, but you're not doing that. So Susan, does Corel versus Bridgman apply to a 3D scan of a sculpture, of a public domain sculpture? A slavish? Well, it sounds like this is you're trying to make as perfect a reproduction as you can, right? Slavish reproduction, to use the phrase.
Sure. Yeah.
This is sort of an interesting question.
So I think the way that the typical law student, sort of the 101 of copyrights would be, is that the copyrights are the right to exclude someone else from making a copy. And then the right to exclude someone else from selling or distributing the copy, or making a derivative work, which is what's really the interesting area for artist and designer, and ultimately for the scanners. You know, using that as a starting point, right? So if I want to design a water bottle, and I'm lazy, instead of starting from scratch, I could scan this one and then start changing it around, right?
There's a reverse engineering prospect to this whole thing.
So, but if there's a copyright in the shape of this bot, let's pretend it's a piece of sculpture. It'll be easier to imagine this. So this is a very original, lovely piece of sculpture that only made one. Famous artist, right? And it's still a copyright, so it's still within the life plus 70 years. So if I scan this, have I made a copy? Is a copy in the computer a copy? Well, those cases, yes, we have those cases. So if just because it's in a computer, it's a copy, right? But what if I then start tinkering with this lovely sculpture? Maybe it's a figure of a woman. Maybe I put a dress on her, or I change the angle of her head, or I turn her shoulder a little. All those things are a derivative because I started with the one that I scanned, right? And this is where we get into appropriation art, because in the art world, the artists have persuaded the courts that because they've given this name, appropriation art, to in fact taking someone else's artwork, taking someone's photograph and putting watercolor, magic marker on it, right? Taking someone else's postcard picture with copyrights in it of two people holding 8 puppies.
Yes.
And then casting it, Jeff Koons, right? Is that somehow artists are separate and they're doing something, they're commenting, they're doing something. So this is very, very unclear area. Very, very, very unclear. But if what you're doing is you're scanning something and you're not creating a work of art, you're creating another commercial object that you're going to then mass produce and sell, then a lot of those cases, I believe, really don't apply to you. Right? And it will be much more down to, were there copyrights in that object and what did you take, right?
Computer display, sorry, thanks. Is the scan then on the, say, the vector drawing of that from the scanner on the computer display, a representation more like a photograph of that object, and until I print that object, I don't really have the replica of the object, because there's a materiality to the object itself. I just, maybe we're making too fine points.
No, I'm sorry. I should explain why we're giggling. So I turned to them and I said, so our minds are running to remedies because we're lawyers. So which ends up with who cares, right? I mean, you personally have a copy in your laptop.
Yeah, no one's going.
Right.
That's a consequence, right?
Right.
And,
it's like a negative.
And even if they did sue you, they could get an injunction. You no longer have a copy. Where are the damages, right? So some of this, there'll never be a case about it, right? And it doesn't. There's not really a consequence to it. But when you have 10,000 copies and somebody's making money on it, that's a different matter.
But I think one of the points embedded in there is the fact you haven't actually made a physical copy, but you have this vector image. Is that what you said? That's still a copy, probably, and a derivative work or something under copyright. You have technically done something that infringes, even though you haven't actually made the physical object.
But then we get back to some of the comments that you've made about, well, wait a minute, is this what we care about? Is this what someone else is going to care about? But in terms of training young designers, they do want to design things that ultimately 10,000 people want to, or in the case of the iPad, how many people now own an iPad? Somebody had those numbers earlier.
Wow.
2016 phones.
Well, then they care. Then they care. Then they care. As Samsung found out, then they care. Right? You copy my design, and then they care. So I think that we're actually a little past our time. Sorry, but I want to thank our panel all, and we have refreshments outside, and we can continue.
Actually, the reception is up on the 4th floor, right above this room. So just go to the 4th floor, and the reception is ready to go. We'd like to thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. I think we had some wonderful discussions and input today. And thank you to all of my colleagues who also helped organize all the speakers. Thank you to all the speakers. I've really learned a lot. It's been a great day. And the flowers, please take them home to your spouse, your significant other, because we have more flowers upstairs and we've paid for them, so take them, okay? Thank you very much.